Hey everybody, it's Achilles Justice here with the Philosophy Society. It is June 5th, 2024. It's a Wednesday. We are in the Toronto Metropolitan University Library, room 859. These are good rooms. This room's a little, it's not the best for like the picture here, but whatever. We are going to begin. I'm going to start with discussing the principles that I wrote in the group chat briefly. And then Daji wanted to go through a presentation on God. And then I have a presentation on God, and we will after that go through. We're not going to get through all the God stuff today, so we're going to start it and then continue it next week. We may not even get through it all of it next week, and then we'll just go it as far as we have to until we're done. And then after that, we're going to go through at least, I'd like to get up to page 136 in the 7 Habits of this edition. So that's when he goes through different principal centers, different centers that one can have, and then he gets the principal center, and we'll start that next week. So I am going to quickly go through these principles that I listed, just so we can have a sense of things. So the reason I bring this up sometimes is because somebody evoked me. There's a reason why I did, right? And in my experience of teaching this stuff and going through these things for many, many years, there are different kinds of people with different personalities and different predispositions. And so I think principles are important. Principles are different than values. Principles guide you to action. So I think it's important to recognize that. And they're supposed to simplify something in the world. And they're usually in some category. So we're studying a book on principles. And principles is not really clearly defined that well in here, I don't think. I think there's we could offer a better definition, But the definition I just gave is relatively okay, because you could have a principle of carpentry, like measure twice, cut once, right? Or a principle in physics, like, gravity attracts the heaviest object, gravity will attract smaller objects to it, something like that, right? And so principles of the Philosophy Society is, all principles, I would say, are related to certain values, like in mathematics, not to make an error. I'm not going to make certain mistakes. It's not good for me to make errors, right? Because then my equation will pump out incorrect information, and that's not good for me. So in the Philosophy Study, certain things are important. One thing is like the cohesiveness of the group. I want us to feel good here and to want to come back, right? But often being philosophical can mean like arguing and being disagreeable, and there's like a tenet of arrogance that can permeate philosophical discussions. So my principles are trying to avoid that, and also trying to avoid like appeal to authority. Like just because somebody says something, it makes it true, and that's not the case. And the way I try to conduct myself, and these principles apply to everybody, including me. So once I teach them to you, or I bring them up, then you guys can use them against me. And that's a good thing, because it makes me a stronger person, right? And it reinforces that I don't want this group to be structured in that kind of a hierarchy. I want it to be structured horizontally based on merit, right? So you don't have to have a PhD to have wisdom. You know what I mean? And so the first principle comes with the value of understanding. We communicate our ideas so we can understand them. You could also say communication could say talking, it could be thinking. I'm thinking about things, I'm trying to understand them. And that's in contrast to being right. I'm saying it because it makes me feel good that I know what I'm saying, or something like that. That's not really going to lead anyone to any sort of truth or underlying comprehension of things. Whereas understanding is how we put all things together, right? We listen to others to understand their ideas. So this has the value of empathy embedded in it, right? I'm listening to you to see what is your perspective. Because sometimes people can do is you can say 3 words and they'll cut you off and disagree with you, but they actually don't understand your perspective. They have a misinterpretation of what you're trying to say. And so they'll make some argument against what you're saying, but it's not valid. It's actually an incoherent argument because it's based on incorrect information. So I want to understand your position. And what I can do is I can summarize it. I can say, do you mean this? And then you would say, yes, I do. And I'm like, okay, if that is true, then how does this make sense? Or I love the fact that you brought this up. I never thought of it before, right? So the third principle, I'm going over this because I think it was better to do it over here. The third principle is we make sense of our ideas through philosophy or being philosophical, right? So even if you're a scientist, how you make sense of it, how you theorize it, is in some ways being philosophical. Like a PhD is a philosopher of biology, right? And so the cognitive tools of reasoning, I'm going to make sense of things by looking at different statements and seeing how they connect together, right? Logic, which is, it's similar. Reasoning is a psychological process, whereas logic is like an abstract formulation of symbols or through language, right? And some things we can determine don't make sense because they, for example, are contradictory. And so using Aristotle's 3 laws of thought really helps us as principles. Laws, principles are kind of almost the same thing here, right? Like like the law of non-contradiction. 1 can not equal -1, for example, right? If you start getting fuzzy with those laws of thought, then it's really going to be hard to know what makes sense. You won't even know who you are, right? How would you know? Because when I look at myself, or the law of identity, 1 equals 1, I know that that's who I am, right? But if I don't have the law of identity, then how would the chair still be the chair the next time I look at it? So the laws of thought are almost fundamental in the way that we experience the world, right? And critical thinking, that's basically being cognizant of what people say to me and what I'm thinking about in general in a way that I'm always trying to piece stuff together. So thinking and reasoning would be a smaller form of thinking, and it would be in the same category of critical thinking, but you can think about stuff that doesn't make sense. I can think like, it's like, what the hell was that? It was nonsense, right? It does not make sense, right? But it was still some thought. It was just a garbage thought, you know? And so we educate ourselves and we engage in discussion to refine the quality of thought that we have. And you can utilize critical thinking to be very, very proficient at thought. And so that's one of the things that it's a value, but the practice would be the principle. And then there's specific behaviors that you do, right? And science. Science is very useful. There are problems with science, and we can use these other philosophy tools to observe science and understand it, but it is very useful in the sense that it tries to standardize the knowledge we have and make it universal, that no matter who you are, you can say, this is true. It is a fact. That's where facts come from, right? Predominantly. And then sometimes accepting that we're wrong is the only way to be right. And that is what I would say is a healthy way of being humble. Is that, oh, okay, I was incorrect about that, you know, and to accept that. But sometimes people can have a weird sense of self-esteem by trying to prove others wrong. They have this downward social comparison that I have value when you are below me. And this is a symptom of narcissism. It is a mental illness. We don't want to get involved in that. If you're correct about something, we want to give you praise for that. Good job. You've done something well, right? And we want to acknowledge that, and all of us, right? But if someone focuses on that, like in a distorted way, it can lead down to negative paths. And so we want to socialize ourselves to not act like that, right? And arrogance is not accepting when you're wrong. So we don't want to be arrogant. Being delusional is when our beliefs are clearly inconsistent, contradictory, right, are not based in evidence. So, for example, the God delusion, right? So Richard Dawkins would say that the belief in God is delusional, and there are reasons for that. And ignorance, speaking about something that we don't know. And so ignorance, I think there's like willing ignorance and just like ignorance where you just don't really know. If you're just like going off on a tangent and you're not making sense of stuff, right? I think it's important to know what kinds of claims are factual and do your best to find out what those facts are, because we all make mistakes. So if you make a mistake or an error, just accept it, right? And like, oh, I was wrong. Yeah.
Just a brief question, like, you know, the way Richard Dawkins says God is delusional, belief in God is delusional. Is that because he runs on a different set of metaphysical beliefs than people who believe in God have? Or is that they run on the same metaphysical beliefs, but he's just better at synthesizing logic from that belief?
I think he's coming from an evolutionary standpoint that like we are the only animals that believe in a God, and the belief in that God is delusional because there's other forms of explanation that can account for our existence, and we don't need to appeal to an intelligent designer and these kinds of things.
But their metaphysical like beliefs they start from the same grounds.
Well, we'd have to talk about that, but we can get into that in a second. I'm just going to finish this last principle,
Okay.
and then we can go into this topic, right?
Okay.
And ignorance. So we don't want to accept that as a social phenomena in the group, because it's not going to lead us anywhere good, actually. Being arrogant, being delusional, or being ignorant in general, right? And then lastly, the onus of proof is on the one that makes the claim. So if you say something like, the sun is made of cheese, and it's like, and then you must believe me because I said so. It's like, well, bro, you got to give me some either evidence or some like deductive reasoning to prove that sunness equals cheeseness. I really don't know about that, right? The sun existed far before cheese did, because cheese comes from cows, and cows are not as long or as old as the sun. So whatever. I guess not all cheese comes, just vegan cheese too. Okay, soy cheese. So those are some principles that I think are valuable for this kind of a philosophy group to be together. And I define it as the wise group, right? And I would say that those principles are wise because it will allow us to continue the conversation, and people will feel inclusive, right? I don't want people to be disrespectful or to be rude to each other, those kinds of things, or to like cut people off and try to dominate conversations. Obviously, I'm like facilitating, so I talk a lot, but I try to allow people to speak, and I accept criticism when people give me criticism,